So a lot of entities would put money in Hong Kong or in Canada or in Bermuda and other countries and then ship it to the university from these other spaces. So we kind of uncovered this and we made an appeal for the government of the United States needs to do an investigation into the funding of American universities. That if we found $3.5 billion and we're kind of amateurish, not so many resources, we work hard, but we don't have the facilities that law enforcement does. So we're calling for an investigation into the funding of American universities, and there's a direct correlation between universities receiving these funds and chapters of Students for Justice in Palestine, which are connected to the Muslim Brotherhood, that are making university campuses very unwelcoming for Jewish faculty and students. And Barry Cosman, who was here, did a study that over 80% of Jewish American students today have witnessed or experienced an anti-Semitic act in the last 6 months. Whereas women have witnessed or experienced a sexist act, there are about 32% of women experience or witnessed a sexist act, and African Americans witnessing or experiencing racist incidents is in the high 20s. So the Jewish American students are in the 80s. So there's something happening on campus that is in the United States and in the UK that needs to be addressed, and there's a direct correlation between the funding from these people and anti-Semitic activities on campus. So it was an interesting day, and hopefully, we hope that there will be an investigation launched by this administration into anti-Semitism on campus. And then of course, we'll have the panel later looking at the intersectionality of anti-Semitism and racism. And if you've been reading the newspapers, and I'm sure you have, the American political context is at a very interesting moment, so the panel will be appropriate. So I look forward to speaking later and for Sylvia to take the floor. It's good to be back.
Okay, it's always good to hear that things are moving forward in a positive way, and that hopefully things are changing. So as I promised at the end of last session, we've been talking in general about shifting narratives and how important it is to, in the classroom, to be able to correct narratives, but in a way which doesn't alienate people in the classroom and enables them to understand what they are reading and to hear what you are saying. And it's very, very difficult because it's a human situation, and human situations are messy. If they were clean cut, it would make things a lot easier for us. So, as I said, what we're going to do in this half of our two-part seminar this morning is talk about actual social movements and the ways in which they incorporate anti-Semitic tropes, which are often couched not as anti-Semitism, but as righteous anti-Zionism. And I've always felt that our goal in the classroom is to enable students to distinguish between true and false narratives. And part of what we need to do is to keep their minds open and keep their ears open, and that's why I was emphasizing strategies at the end of our time together in the last session. It's one thing to write an article where I think one can go straight forward in the argument, but when you're dealing with human minds, one has to sometimes do what's necessary to bring people along so that they understand the argument. Now, one of the most recognized names among non-sectarian organizations that promulgate anti-Israel narratives as they demonstrate for Palestinian causes, is the Boycott, Divestment, and Sanctions Movement, BDS. As anti-Semitism expert Kenneth Stern powerfully illustrates, the international conferences culminating in the United Nations World Conference Against Racism in 2001 set the stage for equating Israel with South Africa and for launching movements to boycott Israel and Israelis, to divest financially from Israeli ventures, and to isolate and shun Israel internationally in every way. While the United States, as well as Israel, ultimately removed their delegations and left Durban over the openly anti-Semitic as well as anti-Israel rhetoric, the ideas launched in Durban took root and have become accepted in many circles. According to its own website, the BDS movement works to end international support for Israel's oppression of Palestinians and to pressure Israel to comply with international law, end quote. BDS language makes it clear that the original sin was the creation of the state of Israel in the first place. And I say that because their language is for nearly 70 years, okay? For nearly 70 years, takes us back to the creation of the State of Israel. Israel has denied Palestinians their fundamental rights. BDS has 3 principles, and I have them listed on the slide. One is ending its occupation and colonization of all Arab lands and dismantling the wall. This demand accuses Israel of forcing Palestinians into ghettos in order to steal Palestinian land. In other words, the whole legitimate creation by the United Nations of Israel is completely obliterated. And you'll remember at the beginning of our last session, I talked about how necessary it is to start with the basic facts. When we're in an educational setting, there will be plenty of people in the classroom who know the basic facts, but there will also be people who don't know the basic facts. So it's really important to try as much as you can to create an even playing field. Gaza is called the world's largest open-air prison, and Israel is accused in this first principle of committing war crimes against humanity. 2, the statement is recognizing the fundamental rights of Arab Palestinian citizens of Israel to full equality. In this and the following demand, only Arab Palestinians are referred to as indigenous dwellers. Jews living in Palestine from ancient to modern times are non-existent. Israel is accused of subjugating Palestinians who comprise, quote, 1/5 of Israeli citizens, to a system of racial discrimination, forcibly displacing Palestinian communities in Israel from their land, and routinely and openly inciting racial violence against them, end quote. And then the third principle, quote, is respecting, protecting, and promoting the rights of Palestinian refugees to return to their homes and properties as stipulated in UN Resolution 194. This continues a quote from the third principle. Since its violent establishment in 1948, through the ethnic cleansing of more than half of the indigenous people of Palestine, Israel has set out to control as much land and uproot as many Palestinians as it can. As a result of this systematic displacement, there are now more than 7.25 million Palestinian refugees. They are denied the right to return to their homes simply because they are not Jewish, end quote. And I'm sure that many of you sitting here already spot the historical inaccuracies as well as the insightful language, I would call it. This has been examined recently in the New York Times by Nathan Thrall, who discussed the condemnation which is inherent in critiques. Thrall says the BDS movement casts the Israeli-Palestinian conflict as a struggle against apartheid, as defined by the International Criminal Court, end quote. In addition, struggles on behalf of persons of color, such as Black Lives Matter and a variety of groups promoting justice for women, both causes of which many Jews support, are widely viewed as being intersectional with the plight of the Palestinians. In a response to Thrall, Israeli Brigadier General Yosef Kuperwasser, who I know spoke to this group, argues that the BDS movement's overt purpose is to bring down the state of Israel. I would like to also talk to you about, in regard to this, the statements of Judah Pearl, who's the father of Daniel Pearl. You might remember that he was a Wall Street Journal reporter who was captured, and he was asked if he was Jewish, and he declared, "I am Jewish," and his head was removed piecemeal with a knife. So this is Judah Pearl, and he wrote an article for the Los Angeles Review of Books called BDS and Zionophobic Racism. I think this is a really clever nomenclature, because Zion, Z-I-O-N, Zionophobic, sounds like xenophobic, hatred of the other. So what he's doing is he's putting the hatred of Israel into the category of xenophobia, which is not good. Liberals don't like, I'm a liberal, but sometimes liberals lose sight that Israel is part of their world, and by putting Zionophobic into the xenophobic clause, it's really important, because very often the statement is made that people who are pro-Israel are de facto racists, and that since all Jews are white, that it is impossible for Israel to suffer from racial hatred, from racist hatred. And by calling this Zionophobic, he's just in one word calling our attention to the fact that part of what Israel is suffering from is racism against Israel. Judah Pearl writes that the true aim of BDS is, quote, to bombard campuses with an endless stream of invective against Israel. BDS writes piercingly of some real, and remember the last session I stressed that there are terrible things which are happening on both sides, but the reasons for their happening are different, of some real and some invented outrages. And as much as some of these outrages against Palestinian populations are real, as well as those that are invented, what's notable about the BDS language is that there's no awareness, on purpose, no awareness of the suffering of Jews and the very real dangers that support the Jewish citizens of Israel. Here are some of Judah Pearl's comments on Israel's settlements and security wall, which receives so much hateful description. Pearl says, "How can an honest person fixate on the wall and not notice the deeply entrenched triple-tier 100-foot wall of Arab rejectionism that blocks all roads to peace. Assigning guilt to one side only, again, this is Pearl continuing, is dishonest, reckless, racist. Israel derives no pleasure from controlling another people's lives. The current situation is imposed on Israel by neighbors who continue to announce that they wish her dead. BDS's complaints about travel restrictions on students in the West Bank appear grotesque in comparison. End quote. And Pearl points out, as I mentioned earlier, that Omar Barghouti, the co-founder and top ideologist of BDS, stated in 2014, Jews in Israel are not a people. Jews in Israel are not a people. The UN principle of the right of self-determination does not apply to the Jews of Israel. This is what Omar Barghouti said. So whenever we're talking and trying to be even-handed about suffering on both sides of the issue, we need to always, always bring into the discussion the extent to which Jewish history, Jewish suffering, Jewish connections to the land of Israel are completely denied, either ignored or denied, in many of these social movements, in the language of the social movements themselves. BDS calls Israel a white settlers colonialist society, ignoring first the historical Jewish link to Israel, and second, distinctive Jewish peoplehood. If Jews are white in America, those Jews who happen to be white because about a fifth of them are persons of color, but to the extent that persons with paler skin who are Jewish happen to be white in America, that's pretty recent. I'm old enough to remember, and a few other people here are, that in our childhood, Jews certainly were not regarded as white. But we always need to remember that even that statement, which is referred to as a simple factual statement, is just non-factual. And then finally, Pearl delineates Zionophobia, the antipathy to Jewish self-determination, is no less heinous than Islamophobia, the antipathy to Islam and Muslims. So those are some of the things that I wanted to bring to the table about the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement. I felt like it was worth spending a little time on because it's the most commonly known movement. And it has been brought up, voting for it has been brought up at many, many American universities. It actually has not been adopted by many. But we need to understand that the language of the BDS movement is extreme, and it negates many things about Jews and Jewish history, as well as about Israel. Okay, the second second movement I want to talk about is intersectionality. This one has a lot of personal meaning for me because, as I mentioned, I'm an old feminist. And anti-Israel rhetoric has actually been common, especially in the international feminist community, ever since the beginning. So that's nothing new, unfortunately. But it has become much more egregious since the idea of intersectionality has been adopted by many enemies of Israel. Now, the idea of intersectionality, I think, is a really, really important idea. Kimberly Crenshaw in 1989 talked about the fact that people may have something in common with people who they've never met, who don't live near them, because their lives, interests, and problems are similar. So another way of saying that they're similar is to say that they intersect. One of the things I think is ironic is that the reason the Jews in the United States were so active in the civil rights movement, really for many Jews, that was an expression of their Jewishness. My job, when I'm not here, is actually to study American Jews and Jewish identity, and I can tell you that there are so many liberal American Jews who I've interviewed who, when you ask them what does being Jewish mean to you, they talk about working for civil rights. This was their expression of prophetic Judaism, to bring freedom to all the people. And it's real to them, it's internal to them, and it's their understanding of Judaism. So for Jews like that to then be told that because the faces of Jews who were in certain European settings are paler than other faces, that their lives cannot intersect with persons of color in the United States for whom they have worked for decades. This is a big shock. So that's one big shock. And then the second big shock has to do with feminism. For Jewish women who are pro-Israel to be told in many of the women's movements, well, you're not a real feminist, because if you were a real feminist, you would condemn Israel. So there's an orthodoxy there, a rigidity, an unwillingness to see how complex these issues are, which makes Jews once again a kind of a pariah group, pushed out of and delegitimated in movements that many of them were instrumental in forming and working for. I'm going to read to you from an op-ed piece in the Times by a woman named Emily Shire called "Does Feminism Have Room for Zionists?" On March 8th, women around the world will be abstaining from work and rallying in the streets as part of, this was 2017, as part of the International Women's Strike, with the aim of starting an international feminist movement that challenges the sexual, physical, and economic exploitation of women. Emily Shire says, as a proud and outspoken feminist who champions reproductive rights, equal pay, increased female representation in all levels of government, and policies to combat violence against women, I would like to feel there's a place for me in this strike. However, as someone who is also a Zionist, I am not certain there is. Although I hope for a two-state solution, and although I am critical of the Israeli government policies, I identify as a Zionist because I support Israel's right to exist as a Jewish state. Increasingly, I worry that my support for Israel will bar me from the feminist movement that, in aiming to be inclusive, has come to insist that feminism is connected to a wide variety of political causes. Emily Shire continues, I am troubled by the portion of the International Women's Strike platform that calls for, quote, decolonization of Palestine, end quote, as part of the beating heart of the new feminist movement. She says, I am happy to debate Middle East policies or listen to critiques of Israeli policies, but why should criticism of Israel be key to feminism in 2017? And then she talks about the fact that some of the people who helped plan this march were in fact convicted of deaths of Israelis in terrorist activities. The organizers of the International Women's Strike are not the first feminist group to position opposition to Israel as part of the feminist movement. She reminds us that Columbia University's anti-sexual assault advocacy group, No Red Tape, said that sexual assault survivors are just like Palestinians. And then she talks about the National Women's Studies Association, which voted to endorse, one of the few organizations that did vote to endorse BDS. One of the things that I asked you to read, if you had a chance, was Janet Friedman's description of what it was like for her arguing against these positions taken by the National Women's Association. So the idea that somehow if one is to be committed to women's issues, and if one is going to be committed to social justice, that one must automatically be against Israel has become the new orthodoxy in many of these social movements. This poses a tremendous problem for the majority of American Jews, over 70% of whom vote Democratic and identify as liberal, including me, that the things that we really care about in terms of social justice are saying to us, we don't even want you unless you say that the country which offers self-determination to your people, that you condemn that country. So it's really ironic that inclusive, but here is this incredibly rigid, non-inclusive stance that's totally unwilling to look at more than half a side of an issue. I liked very much the comment that Bret Stephens made, which is that saying that the reason that Jews are not really a minority, which is actually, if you look at the numbers, it's ludicrous because we are talking about many millions of Muslims, many, many millions of Christians, and then to say to Jews that they are not a minority when they are such a little minority that if you do a pie where you have all the peoples of the world, you have to write the Jews out in the margins because there's no room to put that little word Jew even on their little segment of the pie the Jews have. The Jews have ceased to be a minority because, as I mentioned in the first session, Jews over the years of their wandering have evolved or developed, I should say, certain coping strategies so that they manage to recoup and to become somewhat successful in many of the places that they've lived. Here's Bret Stephens commenting on the fact that privileged people can be minorities and, in fact, can be subject to racism. That even people who are affluent can be subject to racism. Many Jews are not affluent, but even people who are affluent can be. Bret Stephens says, Jews in Germany were economically and even politically powerful in the 1920s, and then they were in Buchenwald. Israel appears powerful vis-a-vis the Palestinians, but considerably less so in the context of a broader Middle East, saturated with genocidal anti-Semitism. American Jews are comparatively wealthy, but wealth without political power, as Hannah Arendt understood, is a recipe for hatred. Privilege didn't save the congregants of the Tree of Life Synagogue last year. Okay, now we come to discussing a topic which is very painful and troubling, which is that even the Black Lives Matter movement has been, now includes some of this anti-Semitic material. And this has been noticed by some African American leaders in the United States. Jason Hill is an African American public intellectual. He wrote in Commentary magazine an article called My Black Lives Matter Problem. And one of the things that he talked about was that in one of the Black Lives Matters manifestos, the words which are used about Israel are genocide and apartheid. And he, as a black public intellectual, is horrified by this, and he rejects the use of these terms very, very strongly. And I wanted to spend a little time talking about why those words are so problematic and why the use of a word like genocide about Israel is incredibly painful and also incredibly unfair. Journalist Emma Green discussed exactly why the term genocide crosses a red line for Jews. The word genocide was coined to describe the Holocaust. Okay? There was no word genocide before that. 6 million Jews were systematically eliminated from the earth on the basis of blood and faith. Subsequently, a nation was formed where those who survived could go. That's Israel, including those fleeing the homes they tried to return to, only to be met with rejection and renewed violence. And I'm assuming that many of you have read these narratives of Jews who tried to go back to Poland, for example, after the war. Some of them were killed. Some of them realized that if they tried to take their homes back, they would be killed. And that Israel has also become, of course, a home for non-European Jews, for Jews from Arab countries. Jews, many of them with darker skins, Jews who many of them speak Arabic, but there's really no place for them from the countries they've come from, and Israel is their home as well. So Emma Green continues, clearly the accusation of genocide has been trivialized in contemporary social movements. Genocide means the deliberate wiping out of a group of people based on their ethnic or racial background. But in the past 20 years, the word genocide has come to mean any kind of massive racialized oppression. The combination of Black Lives Matters trivializing the scope of the murder in the Holocaust and painting the Jewish state in distorted colors and lacing their statements with florid, leftist, anti-American language as well as anti-Israel language has turned away many Jews who actually support racial equality. So this is one of these terrible, painful ironies. There is no ethnic group in the United States that has supported and continues to support racial justice more than American Jews. Part of what I'm talking about is their voting patterns, their giving patterns, the things they're involved with. American Jews support justice for African Americans in America. But as I said, now they're being told that the state that they also identify with in some ways conflicts with their support for racial equality. The way in which some American Jews deal with this is to say, don't pay any attention to the rhetoric. Just treat the rhetoric like words don't matter. Because they want to continue supporting these causes. So I think it's really important to understand that this is not a case of us against them in terms of the Jewish psychology. In terms of the Jewish psychology, it's a case of the feeling is one of betrayed friendship rather than us against them. That the people who are talking about Israel are people with whom American Jews have allied themselves. And now they are behaving as though American Jews were the enemy. The next group that I am going to talk about, I don't have mixed feelings about. Students for Justice in Palestine has turned out to be one of the most virulent anti-Israel and anti-Semitic groups in terms of the way in which they picture Israel. I've heard from many students on college campuses about the shock. One of the incidents is up here on the slide. At Rutgers University, one student describing that during Apartheid Week, the Students for Justice in Palestine Club stood in front of the dining hall wearing white shirts with red blood splattered, with signs saying, "This is what the Jews did to us." Now you notice that here there's not even the fig leaf of saying this is what Israelis, this is what the Jews did to us. I've heard other situations where the description is that there's a drama going on in a street right outside the university, and in this drama, one student is acting out the Israeli soldier dressed in army fatigues, and the other person is acting out the Palestinian mother with the baby, and the student acting out the Israeli soldier is hitting the Palestinian mother with the baby over the head. This ties in very much with the lectures that we heard yesterday about the constantly bringing babies into the discussion. That's one of the most powerful ways of delegitimating Israel. Okay, a recent development of that has been this Israeli Apartheid Week and the constant use of that term apartheid in regard to Israel, as though Israel should be painted as the new South Africa. And many times the students who run this talk about how they are against anti-Semitism, and it's painted very much in terms of a white-black. These are the white Israelis against the black Palestinians. Of course, the factual incorrectness of that, among other factual incorrectnesses, is that nearly half of Jewish Israelis have Middle Eastern roots. Okay? Nearly half of Jewish Israelis are ethnically different than Jews from Minsk, Poland. It's on many levels, but including that level, it's an incorrect presentation. All right. The next subject that I wanted to talk a little bit about or to bring to your attention has to do with the way in which the tropes from the anti-Semitic forgery, the 19th century anti-Semitic forgery, the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, are now incorporated into a lot of the material which is used against Jews. The protocols, when we say it's a forgery, it pretended to be an instruction book for powerful Jews from all over the world who had this plot about, if you've never read it, you should read it just to see what it says, had this plot about how they would get people who weren't Jewish to do what they needed to be done for the Jews. So they get other people to be their proxies. This is what Jews are like. They have this international conspiracy, and they get people who aren't Jewish to do what they need to do. And that one of the reasons why there are clauses about tolerance, for example, in the United States is because the Jews needed to get the Christian Americans to be tolerant to them, so they managed to convince them. So like anything that's ever happened that worked out to benefit the Jews, it's because the Jews figured out a way to get other people to do things for them. Another thing that the Protocols of the Elders of Zion is they get non-Jews to fight wars for them, and so on and so forth. Yoel Kotkin, who you heard speaking here yesterday, says that for millennia following the destruction of the Second Temple and the beginning of the diaspora, Europe was home to the majority of Jews. Their chapter is over. The continent is fast becoming a Jewish ghost town and graveyards, but unlike the anti-Semitism of Nazism and other totalitarian regimes, today's right-wing anti-Semitism is not nearly as powerful a threat to Jews as the alliance of Islamists and left-wing activists to blame Jews. So one of Kotkin's studies shows that barely half of Europeans think that Israel has a right to exist. There's similar anti-Semitic and anti-Zionist trends among liberals in the United States, and they have become, much of the liberal community in the United States has become a kind of zealotry of anti-Israelism. There are some analysts in the United States who think that what's happening, and I don't believe this is true, I hope it's not true, but Ross Douthat, who's a conservative columnist, and some other people like him think that one of the reasons that it's become acceptable to articulate these statements, which are so overtly anti-Semitic as well as anti-Israel, is because the stature of Jews is diminishing in the United States. And not too long ago, there was a study of minorities in the United States that said that Jews were the most respected minority in the United States. But Ross Douthat and others like him think that that sort of reached a peak, and now it's on a decline. And according to Douthat, arguments whirling around freshman Congresswoman, American Congresswoman Ilhan Omar's repeated toxic tropes in her critiques of Israel are no accident. He says that left-of-center politics that remembers the Holocaust as one great historical tragedy among many, and then judges Israel primarily on its conservative and nationalist political orientation, and pays no attention whatsoever to its status as a Jewish sanctuary, and I would add, and pays no attention whatsoever to the political situation which it, not of its own making, that it often finds itself with, and regards the success of American Jews as a reason for them to join white Gentiles in a check your privilege self-criticism, cedes moral authority to minority groups who appear to be more Jewish, more oppressed. So one of the things that I've been trying to get across today is that narratives really matter a lot. The stories that are told about other people, those become for us a kind of living history. That's what narratives are. And for American Jews, who mostly situate themselves in circles where liberal, leftist, anti-Israel views are freely expressed, there's a profound discomfort. American Jews find themselves in a place where everything that they agree with politically is over here, but then their feelings about Israel don't fit into that package. Singling Israel out by saying they cannot support Israel because Israel's established was artificial and violent. This is a quote. One of the articles that I read, which had interviews with people who were active in each of the movements that we just looked at. And people who were active in those movements said that they could not support Israel because when Israel was established, it was artificial. I guess that means the UN, yes? So it was declared a country by the UN, so that made it artificial, and it was violent. Now let's think a little bit about why it was violent. Where was the violence in the creation of Israel? The day after Israel was declared a state, she was attacked by huge Arab countries all around her. This seems a little bit like blaming the victim. So Israel is attacked by armies that say they want to annihilate Israel. They want to annihilate Israel because Jews do not belong in a powerful position in an area which should be entirely under Muslim control. That is the language that was used by the countries surrounding Israel at the time. That is all there in the historical record. So what does it mean to say that the creation of Israel, and this is a very important trope now among young people in these movements, to say that the creation of Israel was artificial and violent. How were other countries created? Was it like in a Disney movie? Like the country just floated down in a little parachute and then everybody was happy and wearing leis of flowers and singing? Elie Wiesel said that the situation of the world is that every country was formed on a pile of corpses. Elie Wiesel doesn't throw around this kind of language casually. He said this in the context of defending Israel. What he was saying is that it's one of the things that means that we don't have a redeemed world. If you want to talk about, if you believe in the age of the Messiah, one of the definitions of the age of the Messiah is that countries and people won't have to interact with each other in violence. But the United States of America was formed through the American Revolution. That was violent. The slaves in the United States were freed through the Civil War. That was violent. The Nazis were defeated through violence. I'm an English major originally, and we learned about the Norman invasion of England. You know, every country was formed at some point in the history of the country through violence. And many countries in the world were formed artificially. The big powers in the interwar period sat down with a map of much of the Middle East and divided up territories, sometimes not very brightly. And there was a lot of violence associated with that. So you see that here Israel, even though Israel was formed legitimately through a vote in the United Nations, that whole narrative, if you want to use the narrative, those historical facts have been thrown out with this narrative that somehow the formation itself, this is a birth story, this is really, really important. Somehow the formation of Israel itself was illegitimate. It was artificial and violent. That makes it illegitimate. We need to understand, and this is one of the things that I would so much hope we can do for our students. Help them to see when a narrative contains historical facts and when it ignores human history, when it ignores historical facts, which is part of what's going on in these various movements. A second narrative distortion of Israel, which I think is really important for us to pay attention to, is the idea that Jews do not have the right to self-determination. Jews are not a minority, and I talked already about the numerical ridiculousness of that. Jews are not a minority, and they are white supremacists, so they don't have the right to self-determination. Now, historically, this is so backwards and inside out in terms of Jewish attachment to causes to help liberate persons of color. But even if they were the worst people in the world, there are actually other people who've done crummy things. And if we go around and we look at countries in the world that have their own country and nobody says, oh, well, you can't be a country. Nobody came to France and says France can't be a country because what France did in Algeria and Indochina. You want to talk about massacres? But somehow, La France, everybody understands that it's a legitimate country. So I think that, again, in helping our students to always bring the lens of history to what these movements are doing, what they say, what the rhetoric is, because there will always be an emotional pull because people are suffering. And people are suffering on both sides of this issue. It's not our job to deny that there is suffering on both sides of the issue, but I think it is our job to bring the historical facts to bear so that we can talk about this and be talking about trying to find justice in the real world. Okay, so everybody here who lives on a college campus knows that there is a lot of rhetoric on college campuses about Israel and about anti-Zionism. And part of the problem that we have as people, especially who teach undergraduates, I'm hoping graduate students have a better historical background, but let's just say undergraduates. Most undergraduates, at least in the United States, know very little about world history. It's always a little shocking when you start teaching your first semester or two of teaching. I can tell you that the first midterm I gave, I discovered that none of my students had any idea that in the 1800s there wasn't a Soviet Union in Russia. Okay? I mean, it was a class on sociology of American Jews. I actually hadn't thought to go back and talk about when the Soviet Union was established. But what I'm saying is you cannot exaggerate the lack of historical background that at least some of your students will have. So that's another reason that it's really important to always bring history into the narrative. And a lot of the narratives which are promulgated by these social movements, which are mounted to help create justice, okay? A lot of these narratives are total distortions of history. They leave big chunks of the story out, and especially they leave the Jewish experience, the modern Jewish experience out. The Israeli and Israeli-Palestinian conflict is spotlighted with a total absence of context. And another charge which is often made is that there's no difference between criticizing Israel's policies and delegitimating Israel's right to exist. And these are really very, very different things. I would say the majority of American Jews actually are critical of many of Israel's policies, and lots of Israelis are critical of Israel's policies. You can read Haaretz if you would like to see the loyal opposition. But when those things are lifted out of context and put into the context of delegitimating Israel's right to exist, I think we need to understand that this is it's a negation of Jewish history. It's a negation of the concept that Jews are an actual peoplehood, and the Jews have the right to self-determination like any other peoplehood. I think we need ourselves to recognize anti-Semitic tropes when we see them, and it's part of our job to help our students see them. So what I'd like to finish with is this, and then I would like to have your ideas about this as well. I think that part of our job is correcting ahistorical anti-Semitic narratives which are embedded in today's movements. Anti-Zionist attitudes promulgated by many of the social movements that I highlighted today illustrate the triumph of anti-Semitic alternative narratives over historical fact. I'm very aware that I live in a country in which fake news is a term which is thrown around and often applied to the real news. So I think we're living in a situation right now in which just saying there is such a thing as real history and real news automatically puts you in a certain box politically. But I think it's for Jews especially, and for people who care about Jews and teach Jewish history, this is super important. Jews have nothing to gain by the erasure of real historical facts. Again, I think we need to distinguish between criticism of Israel's policies versus delegitimating Israel's existence and denying the right to Jewish self-determination. I think that we need to recognize and correct anti-Semitic images, ideas, and tropes. And this goes back to the discussion we had earlier. We're not doing it in a vacuum. We're all going to get pushback. We all get pushback. We have students in our classes who believe many different things. We need to not make them into martyrs in the classroom. That will not be helpful. We need to, if nothing else, use empathy as a strategy. But we need to make sure that our students leave with an understanding of what is and is not an actual narrative, and what is an anti-Semitic statement, even if it's embedded in the language of social justice. We need to help them balance positive and critical narratives about Jews and Israel. And you'll remember when I was talking about what is modern anti-Semitism, one of the things I had in block letters was that Israel and Jews need to be evaluated with the same scales that are used for everybody else. Jews don't have a responsibility to be better than anyone else. When Jews go to the synagogue on Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, each Jew may feel that he or she needs to be the best person they can be. But on the international stage, Jews do not have a responsibility to be better than anyone else, to deserve having the same rights and privileges as other people do, because Jews actually are part of humanity with all of humanity's foibles and difficulties. I think we need to recognize that Jews are diverse. There are honest Jews and dishonest Jews. There are Jews who have political attitudes, behaviors, projects that we like, and Jews that have political attitudes, behaviors, and projects that we despise. So we should work against them, but we have to be careful that that doesn't get attached to Jews as a people. So I think that's as much as I have to say, and I would love to hear what you have to say about this topic. Yeah.
Thanks, Professor, for the lecture. I appreciate that we've been focusing a lot on the power of narratives. I've spent a career crafting narratives and disseminating narratives, and I think we're spot on about that. But I'm having a hard time squaring some of the language that we're using in terms of the word empathy, using empathy to sort of confront false tropes, untruths, and what have you. Particularly given my own experiences, I mean, I've been the subject of, if you want to substitute narrative for stereotypes, I have been, when I was a student at NYU, I was roughed up by the police coming back to my dorm because I had a hoodie on and it was raining outside. When I was a journalist, a pretty prominent journalist, I've been at rallies and been called a nigger before, and I'm choosing to use that word. I've been in the newsroom around other esteemed colleagues, and despite my own sweat equity in getting to where I was, been accused of being the token black in the newsroom. Those are all false narratives, or at least an action by the police that was driven by a false narrative or a false stereotype. In none of those cases did I decide to respond to them with empathy. I responded to them by reporting the incident and confronting the people who were saying the things they were saying based on false narratives. So I feel that in the academy, that when students or when people outside of the academy as well, when they say false things about white people, Jewish people, women, homosexuals, black people, what have you, that it's inherent on us to say no, to have sort of a zero tolerance policy for it. We can try to understand where it's coming from after we confront that this is ridiculous, it's untruth, it's not informed by anything, it's biased and all of that. But this notion of being empathetic or sympathetic, to me, seems that we allow for those things to grow, to disseminate, and I'm concerned as we go off, especially professors and craft our syllabi for developing some of these courses, that if we adopt that strategy, we allow more students in the academy to say, you know what, I feel not only permissible, but emboldened to go out because I know that the people, the professors hearing this, will just give me empathy and allow me to say those kinds of things.
So I'm so glad that you made that comment. I think it's a super important comment. Let me just point out a difference between the scenario that you described with a horrible assault by the police and the situation of a professor in the classroom. The police person was the person with authority. That person was acting in an illegitimate way in his treatment of you, who was a vulnerable citizen, okay? You were a vulnerable citizen. The person with authority was mistreating you. Of course you should report it and do whatever else you can to make that right. But the professor in the classroom, that professor is the person with authority. And when you are the person in authority, you shouldn't be that policeman. All I'm saying in terms of talking about empathy is that when the professor is viewed by the students in the class as misusing their authority to embarrass a student unnecessarily, my experience is that the classroom dynamic is that the students in the class will come to the aid, will identify with the student, even if the student made a really bad racist statement, because they are peers. The students are peers, and the professor is the policeman. The professor is the one in authority. So what I'm recommending is to assume good intention, even if falsehood, of the student initially. So like, if you'll remember, the conversation that came up in the first session was a student, an Arab student, who said that Zionism means killing babies, okay? It's a false statement. It's terrible. It's goes back to some of those libels that we talked about yesterday. But if the assumption is first that the student is making this false statement out of ignorance, what the conversation was, that it is better to first understand that student's pain, but then to clarify historically what actually the facts are. And I would say to do that in a strong way, not to do it in a way so that everything is clear, what really is the case. It's up to a particular professor whether that professor feels it works better for him or her to first make the strong statement and then be empathetic, or to first be empathetic and then make the strong statement. My experience is that in terms of the classroom dynamic, because as one of the speakers said yesterday, and I think it's absolutely brilliant, who you're really talking to in that classroom in terms of wanting them to understand what's happening is the whole middle group. The person who has extremist ideas on the right or the left is probably not listening to you that carefully anyway. Their mind is closed. But you want to bring along as much of the middle of that class as you can to understanding your interpretation of what's happening. And if you seem to be adding to the pain of a student who's made a statement by putting the student down harshly to start out with because the student has made a false statement, strategically, you may end up alienating so much of the class that they don't even listen to what you're saying. I'm not disagreeing with you at all, that we have a responsibility as educators to help our students understand the truth, and see an untruth and recognize it for what it is. I am saying that from not just humanitarian, but also for strategic reasons, it is often better to do it in one way rather than another way, but you might find that the other way works better for you. Yeah?
Thank you, I work with the students, many of the students here who are the research scholars, so this is a real pleasure hearing from you. I just want to share one thing. So, I was born May 1st, 1961. I don't say that so everyone can remember my birthday. I say it for two reasons. One is, that was the day that Fidel Castro declared that Cuba's revolution was a socialist revolution. But it also was the day that training began. This is weird reasons I'm a trainer. That training began for the freedom rides. May 1st, 1961. That's when the training began. That's when I came out. Now, that's where I am on that continuum. So I am at kind of at a cellular level, some kind of representation of what a couple of revolutions look like. So I'm concerned about. I appreciate reading what you say, but there are a couple of things in terms of narratives I think I like to push back on. One is the minority idea, because I find it a little bit of a straw man, to speak of the minority of the Jewish population in purely numerical terms. When as a political scientist, I have to share with my students that when we discuss minorities, we also talk about the power of minorities. That's a big difference. And hence, you can see where some confusions and perhaps false narratives are leveled against the minority that rules South Africa and the minority population. It was a numerical minority. It was not a power minority. Right? So I mentioned that. I'm not making the analogy. I'm just pointing out the principle that there are more ways to look at this concept as we try honestly, I think, and with integrity to look at language. Now, the other concern is broader, and it's more points to those freedom rights. It is, and I used to read Thoreau, so I used to go to the Rights Museum all the time, the Woolworth store. It is absolutely true. It is absolutely true that blacks and Jews walked hand in hand. Yep. More so then than we do now. And I'm hoping that we'll get there. And we will. But I'd like to point out, and I think that many people here know, because I had some coffee conversation with folks that there's an elephant in the room.
You're not talking about me, right?
No. You're see what that. But really in terms of just the idea that there was not self-interest. There was self-interest in the Jewish population, as there was self-interest for the black population, because we were each, I would argue, and many others have argued, fighting for our own soul salvation. There were signs that saying no blacks, no Jews. There were signs saying no dogs. And this was before the whole conversation about Jews in country clubs and whether Jews are white. And it was also before the fissure of the thing that I studied when I was here, affirmative action. And that's where a lot of the divide went on. In fact, Charles and I were in a seminar when I got yelled at for giving Nathan Glazer a really hard time.
That's when I started respecting you.
That's when we became friends. He's like, I hate antisemitism. I'm like, I hate racism. Let's be friends. And it is the thing. So I want a real conversation. I want a real conversation. And it can be messy. But I want a real conversation. Because if we are going to forge greater understandings as human beings, and you're not fighting for my soul salvation. I don't owe you a thank you for working on the civil rights movement. And you don't owe me one. Because you are my sister. And I'm your brother. I am your keeper, you are mine. So, I want a real conversation. And that may be a question we need to see.
So I agree with you. I agree with you 100%. I hope this is the beginning of a conversation. I would simply ask us both not to look for purity of motive. I think that behavior, Jewish culture stresses very much behavior rather than so much purity of motive. Because when someone does something for someone else, even if it was partially self-interest, that thing was done for the other person. Certainly that's something Jews have experienced in many, many, many situations in Jewish history where Jews had no power. They were a minority, but had no power. And there were people from outside the Jewish community who were helpful, and perhaps they had self-interest also. Maybe it made them feel better about themselves. Maybe they felt like a gallant knight, to use Cynthia Ozik's language. But it was still better for those Jews that that person did it. So it's not a question of thank yous. It's a question of, again, maybe this is a Jewish cultural bias. My bias is to look at behavior. And words insofar as they comprise a kind of behavior, but not so much to look into each other's souls wanting purity. I mean, my own personal bias is that we are all rather impure beings. We need sometimes to accept impurity of motive in ourselves and also in other people. The other thing that I would just say is that in that real honest conversation that I hope will happen, it's important to remember that, as Brett Stevens pointed out, that money and power is power of one kind, which some Jews have. Political power is something else. That part of the reason for the establishment of the State of Israel was because Jews had no political power. That the whole idea of the right to self-determination is about political power. And people could agree or disagree that Jews need it, but what people can't disagree about is the history of Jewish suffering, Jewish extermination in the last 100 years. I mean, that's real. And the numbers of Jews matter when you are in a small numbered group. It's not competing atrocities. It is not competing suffering. We can recognize everyone's suffering and everyone's concerns without saying, oh, this particular group, things aren't really so bad. These are so bad, and these are so bad, and these are so bad. And let's work together. Can I call on someone else? Where's my guy there? Can I take another comment? Yes? Okay. All right. Yes, over here.
I just have two quick statements. The first one is, thank you first very much for sharing. I think it's critically important to hear the stories and narratives from people of their own group and let them tell their own stories. So toward that end, I'll situate myself. I'm Black and American. And one of the things about words I wanted to say was when we talk about undergraduate students, I think it's very important as faculty to keep in touch with the K-12 system, because in the United States, a lot of history just is not taught, so they're not deficient because they don't know it. And starting with new generations, they're never even taught cursive language, cursive writing. It's not taught in school, so when they can't read your board, we have to remember not to be ageist and to do that. So that was my first point. My second point was looking at the slide that talked about all those Benjamins, all these Benjamins.
Yeah.
And of my situatedness as a Black person in the U.S., all these Benjamins are all about the Benjamins, has nothing whatsoever to do with Jewish people. So I think it's important to understand that, because we're talking about the person on the $100 bill. It has nothing to do with, so that was a very interesting interaction with that, because it has nothing to do with.
I hope you are right that that was what was intended. That I'd be thrilled.
That's what it means to my culture.
Yeah.
I'm just saying.
Yeah, that would be
just to
great.
realize that.
Yeah.
Or maybe it's just me.
Yeah. Okay. One more, I guess. Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you, Sylvia, for doing just a wonderful job in every way, including underscoring the practical application that we can take into the classroom. It's extremely important. I'd like to point out that on May 29th, it was officially announced this year, 2019, that because of the very uncomfortable conversations resulting from Congresswomen like Ms. Omar, there has been established, and it is already taking place, a new Black Jewish task force in the House of Representatives, that their objective is to face what we are dealing with in an effort to bring a new chapter, a new narrative of potential cooperation into our political system. I think that's a very, very important step. Secondly, I'd like to recommend, there is a 10-part series that you would, I think, enjoy seeing. It is called Pillars of Fire, and it is the documentary history with all original filming from the birth of Israel all the way to contemporary times, which include the anti-Israel organizations. And for those of us who might need extra history in our class teaching regarding this particular group, I think that that would be helpful. And I want to just really rephrase my view towards what you said. I think that it is, I would also ask you to understand very politely, is that powerful minorities can be absolutely harmed. And what we are watching in terms of Jewish life, the growth of Jewish fear, not really on our campuses, but with large percentages of French Jews leaving their homeland, France, to uproot themselves, etc. What we are watching is the return of new forms of anti-Semitism in Germany. We're watching the far right emerge politically. This, it should not be people with money or people who have been successful can't understand or put us in the same category. Similarly, I would say to understand what we are faced with today is what we're experiencing and what is defined by the Jewish community, a cancer of anti-Semitism. It is spreading in a variety of ways which we were shocked and unprepared to respond to. And boy, do we want everyone's help on this. And would we love to share our resources and help with communities that want our assistance. Thank you.
What she said.
Yes, we're running late for lunch. We'll do one more question. Anybody
Okay.
else? And then we'll,
Okay.
Okay. Let's Sylvia.
What?
You can choose one.
Oh,
Hang on.
yeah, no, I see you.
Okay.
Okay, thank you. I just want to go back to what Shannon said real quick, because I think it's really important, especially for a bunch of educators to hear. I think, yeah, so when we're talking about basically kind of shutting down speech in the classroom and things like that, I think it's really important to distinguish between being firm and being patronizing. I think that, you know, the question I would ask is, where do you think that police officer came from, right? Like, you know, we're talking about over time people, you know, taking these ideas to the point where you would have someone, the first thing they say is Zionism is killing babies. You know, that comes from years and years of being fed a narrative and no one pushing back on that narrative in the right way. And so I just want to say, like, I'm from Georgia, right? You know, I worked on construction in rural areas with a bunch of poor white people who were blatantly racist, and you can separate the fact that, yeah, they're hurting, rightfully so, because they've been not equally, but, you know, they've been downtrodden by society and they're not having a good time, but the fact that they're blaming it on black people, that's where the problem comes in. So Palestinian children dying is definitely an issue that needs to be discussed, but allowing someone to just, you know, say Zionism killing babies does not have any sort of productive, you know, addition to that conversation. It does not talk about the issue, you know, of the inception of the issue. So I just want to say, firm, not patronizing. You don't have to sound like an asshole, pardon my French, you know, as a professor and shut down your students and therefore alienate part of the class by just saying, hey, you know, that's not factually correct, and then launching into whatever. That's all I want to say. Thank you.
Thank you.
So, yeah, so I just sort of wanted to touch on a few things, but I'll try and keep it really condensed because I know we're late for lunch. This sort of idea of the Israel as a country that's being formed, as many countries have been in the past. While I can understand the historical sort of place that the way that Israel was formed has, I think that there's something to be said about the difference in the voices of people who are being oppressed in terms of the conversation that's being had about it. Of course, a lot of countries were formed on the bodies of others, but that doesn't make it acceptable. And of course, a lot of countries were formed and lines were drawn without considering the people that exist in a region, but that doesn't make it okay. And the idea that we're being unfair by criticizing and by calling something illegitimate, I think is maybe sort of looking at it from a historical lens as in saying that that is the standard. And I don't think it's the standard, and it shouldn't be. Had France and the United States been formed at a time when Native Americans, you know, could speak the language and discuss what was happening to them, the narrative may have looked much the same in terms of people saying, well, this isn't right, you can't just come in and do whatever you want to do. And beyond that, according to my knowledge, and please correct me if I'm wrong, Palestine didn't vote about this. And the Arab nations surrounding that sort of area voted against it. And so you have this sort of pushback from the creation of Israel, and whether or not it has a right to exist, like, that's a whole other thing, and the UN voted so it does exist. But I don't think it's fair to say that we're not looking at a historical lens when it comes to this creation, because historically, the way that nations have been created has been detrimental to minority populations, and not even to minority populations, to people native to that land. And it's been unfair, especially to brown people. And so I think that that sort of understanding leads to a dangerous narrative on the left, that if you're saying that, oh, everything is fine, you're being unfair to Israel, then what you're saying is the way that we create countries is just the way we create countries. There's no need to critique that, and it's unfair to fight against something that has created historically so much oppression, if that makes sense.
Okay. I will, since I have been strongly encouraged to answer things that you...
60 seconds.
I'll do my best. First of all, over and over again, I talked about critiquing Israeli policies. So the phrase, it's okay that was not at all the presentation. The presentation was that it is perfectly appropriate to critique Israeli policies. However, the top bold sentence of anti-Semitism is applying standards to Israel or to Jews which are different than the standards applied to other countries. And when I was talking about countries in the Middle East being formed by just being divided up by the powers between the two world wars, that wasn't a million years ago. It was basically the same historical framework as the formation of Israel. So we're talking within a couple of decades of each other. There were many countries that were formed by the powers that be, dividing things up. Israel, unlike them, actually, there was a vote. We understand in the United States that people vote, and the people that vote the most win that particular vote. Sometimes, as with our current president, it wasn't even the people who voted the most, but that's something else, okay? But the results of a vote or an election mean that that is what will happen. So I want to come back to that sentence about judging Israel with the same standards as everyone else. We want to talk about suffering, then in order to be intellectually honest, we have to go and look at other countries right now, not 1,000 years ago, not even 60 years ago. What's happening in the world right now? When we have demonstrations, when we have many organizations talking about social injustice in Israel, what organizations do we have talking about social justice in, you pick 15, 20 other countries, see what's happening. We want to talk about the status of women. We want to talk about the status of gay, lesbian, trans, queer people. You can take subject by subject. Look at Israel and look at other real countries right now. What is the status of people of color? What is the status of all these other groups? And then evaluate Israel compared not to purity and not to perfection, but to the way real countries live in the world that we live in. I'm not saying that Israeli policies are necessarily okay. I'm saying that we should critique Israel with the same heart and the same mind and the same standards that we use for other countries. And if we use a different standard for Israel, then whether we know it or not, we are behaving in an anti-Semitic way.
I'm going to make one announcement before I make the announcement. Sylvia, on behalf of everybody here, thank you so much for sharing your wisdom.